Welcome back to the PolicyViz podcast. I'm your host, John Schwabish. On this week's episode of the podcast, I chat with Ethan Mollick from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. And you're thinking, why am I talking to a professor at the University of Pennsylvania? Well, you might recall from a few months ago, if you're in the data viz world, from a few months ago, there are a bunch of really cool images created from the DALL-E artificial intelligence tool that were plays on data visualization created by famous artists. And those were created by Ethan. And so my instinct was to reach out to him and talk about how does DALL-E work? What does it take? What do you need to do? And he wrote back and said, I'd be happy to talk about it, but there's really not much to talk about it. You just kind of throw it in there and you just see what it does. And so that was kind of fun to hear that. So we do talk about his experiments with DALL-E and we talk about that work, but we also focus on what he does with Twitter. And of course, Twitter is going through its own changes and we'll see what happens with Elon Musk taking it over. But I find Ethan's Twitter feed really interesting because he spends so much time summarizing academic papers. And so he'll take a screenshot of different parts of a paper, including graphs and the abstract or some text, and we'll summarize it for folks really quickly. And so it's really interesting from someone like me coming from the economics field, working in this, writing and working in the academic literature. But I wanted to pick his brain about how academics could do a better job with the data visualizations in their academic writing. And so we spend most of our time actually talking about his Twitter feed and talking about some of the solutions that maybe academics can take part in to improve how they can communicate their work. And we also talk about some of his other work at Wharton, including Wharton Interactive, which is working on the entrepreneurship space using games and simulations. Well, of course, that has a direct link to the field of data visualization and data communication. Now, before we get into my conversation with Ethan, let me tell you a little bit about this week's sponsor of the show, Partner Hero. Partner Hero is a outsourcing firm that's built to meet the needs of scaling high-growth startups. They offer flexible terms, they offer fast onboarding, and the ability to scale your teams quickly. They have quality assurance baked into all of their different programs. They have offices around the world so you can work in a variety of different languages, and they're aligned with positive, accessible, equitable values so that you can make sure that you are not exploiting or taking advantage of workers from around the world. And that's what I really like about it the most. It's also super flexible. It's built for the needs of startups in particular, so that allows you to scale up and scale down really quickly. It also has a really fast onboarding process, which of course is going to be helpful for those of us who don't have the time to really be going through all these different processes with invoicing and contracts and all of those different things. So if you are a small business in particular or a freelancer, if you're ready to bring in outside customer support to help your startup and feel like those folks are a part of your team, check out Partner Hero. Head on over to partnerhero.com/policyviz to book a free consultation with their solutions team. Mention you heard about Partner Hero from PolicyViz and they'll waive the setup fee. So that's partnerhero.com/policyviz. So here we go on this week's episode of the show. Here's my conversation with Ethan Mollick from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. Hey, Ethan, good afternoon. How are you?
Excellent, and thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. Beginning of the semester for you?
Yes, I've got a couple weeks left till the next quarter kicks in and I start teaching, but it's certainly on my mind.
Wow, quarters. See, quarters must be hard. I feel like quarters, like once you it's like flying from like DC to Philly. It's like you kind of don't even get up to cruising altitude. You just kind of
Oh, I kind of like it. Like
jump.
you get to, it's like delivering it's like a short set, right, for a college. I got 12 sessions I got to deliver, a tight 12.
Tight 12, yeah. Right. I reached out because you did this really cool thing with this DALL-E artificial intelligence tool that came out with some data visualizations, which I have actually, by the way, a couple hanging on my wall because they're pretty cool. But I thought maybe we'd start just by talking about what you're working on. You've got some really cool initiatives going on at at Wharton and Penn. So I thought maybe we'd start with that and then talk about some of the other things. So do you want to maybe give folks just like your quick like bio, a little background, and what you're starting the semester with,
Sure.
or
So
the quarter with?
yeah, so I'm a professor of innovation entrepreneurship at Wharton, at the University of Pennsylvania, and trained as an economic sociologist. And I teach a lot of the intro courses, or at least I did, in entrepreneurship. And I've been thinking a lot about how do we train these kind of things at scale, and how do we do teaching at scale. So I've been really super interested in teaching, and especially how do we kind of teach in new ways, reach new people, teach the kind of lessons like data visualization lessons that are kind of traditionally hard to teach. And really been thinking about this a lot. I have a massive online course of MOOCs, these kind of Coursera courses.
Mm-hmm.
Like 400,000 people have taken the MOOCs that I'm part of, but they're still kind of watching videos of people talk, right? So there's
Yeah.
something
Yeah.
that's ultimately frustrating about it. So a lot of my effort has been into launching something called Wharton Interactive, which is a game studio at Wharton, effectively, that tries to teach using games and simulations, and to try and do teaching at scale with all the instructional pedagogy built in from the beginning. So that's
Mm-hmm.
been a lot of my time on that. Although I'm also, as you've noted, a pretty avid Twitter user and somebody who's been dipping my feet into things like AI generated images and stuff. So happy to discuss any of
Right.
those things.
So tell me a little bit about the Wharton Interactive. So is this for business school students, getting them training that they're not getting in the core courses, or is it those core courses but trying to develop a way to do it at scale?
So it's a little of both. It's there's a phrase in Silicon Valley is eating one's own dog food, right? So I experiment on my students. Don't tell them that. Hopefully they're not listening.
Yeah,
Uh,
hopefully they won't listen.
I'm
Yeah.
not bad. Like I want your podcast to succeed, so I hopefully they
Right.
listen, but then are tolerant.
Right,
But
right.
no, I mean I have been running experiments. I wrote a book on games and education. I've been doing it for over. I wrote that like over 10 years ago, and so I have a class that's basically my experimental 100% games class. So from a teaching perspective, it's great because I just sit there and my students play my games the whole time. So the intent is that there's a few things that motivate this. One of them is like we actually know a lot of pedagogical science. Just as professors,
Hmm.
we're not really taught it ourselves. But there's actually a
Right,
lot of
right.
like we know how to make people remember stuff and do stuff. So part of
Yeah.
it's baking that in, and then part of it is like experiential learning is great, but has project-based work has all these weird outcomes, right? And you probably see this yourself, and certainly anyone who's teaches knows like a team goes great. Like I think people have from my class and the classes taught my colleagues at Wharton over the last 10 years, people have raised like the entrepreneurship class is like $2 billion in venture capital. Great, right?
Mm.
Except that those
Yeah.
are the projects that have really succeeded, right? And for every
Yeah.
successful
Right.
project, like
Yeah.
the team goes bad. So they like, how do we give people project based work where the projects are always going to be interesting, and where failure is interesting, and where they all have the same kind of experience, rather than hope that the gods of teams and projects work out on their behalf. So that's another big motivating factor. And the third
Hmm.
one is democratization, right? So there's all this evidence, and I know the same stuff happens, and in thinking about things like being a good statistical visual thinker, but just small amounts of statistical education, business education make huge difference in people's lives. So
Hmm.
there's these great studies. One that really motivates me. There's a study in Uganda done by the World Bank that's a randomized controlled trial. All this is my Twitter feed, by the way, if people want sites. But that took a randomized sample of high achieving high school students in Uganda and put them through a 3-week entrepreneurship course, sort of the equivalent of what we're doing in the game. And
Hmm.
afterwards, 3 years later, they were like 10% more likely to launch ventures, 12% more
Mm.
likely to employ people, had 18% higher salaries, like little bits of intervention at the right time, do the right thing. And like, it's
Yeah.
great. I got really talented people coming to me at Wharton, but how do we blow open the doors and do this around the world? So it's those
Right.
motivating factors of like games teach in a way we can't do otherwise. We can build pedagogy in a way we couldn't do otherwise, and we can democratize. So those three
Yeah.
things are really motivating me. And anyone can play
Yeah.
these things. Like some of them are free, and you can play them online. Some of them have the standard kind of charges that we would charge, much less than a textbook, but charges
Right.
associated with them and so on.
Right. Yeah. So can you give folks a sense of what a game might be as part of this?
Yeah, so it's interesting. We've been playing a lot with the philosophy of this. So let me give you an example of the three quick examples. So one example
Okay.
is a mindset game. We want to give people an experience doing something they may not otherwise do. In this case, it's actually data analysis, and coding. So we actually partnered with Evite. And in this game, it's a light fiction. You play as a consultant who has to help. There's like an hour countdown. Someone's on a plane and has to do a big presentation, but you're actually given 3 million lines of actual Evite data. And you actually
Mm,
code in Python in the game and get all this kind of assistance to solve a bunch of
right.
problems and do,
Yeah.
statistical analysis and things like that. A second game is one where you actually run a startup in real time over the course of 3 weeks. And we filled the internet with fake information about the technology which doesn't exist. But you do everything from negotiate with customers, develop prototypes. And again, it's all simulated. Like we built fake Gmail, fake Slack, fake Zoom calls. We have
Gotcha.
actors that appear on these Zoom calls, and it's a whole all interactive. And
Wow.
then
Yeah.
we've realized that there's some value in completely fictionalizing the setting. So we have a game set in 2087 on a doomed space mission to Saturn, where everything is going wrong. We worked with the Disney Imagineers, escape room designers. I got help writing for the guy who won the Hugo Award this year for science fiction, which is like the Oscars of science
Yeah.
fiction for the non-nerds out there. And so, but it's really it teaches you strategic, organizational, individual leadership, because the lessons are exactly marketing lessons and statistical
Right.
lessons and things like that. So it's really an attempt to try to do a lot of different things, not just my stuff, but we're working with lots of other professors to teach these things and try to come up with a
Yeah.
method of doing it as well.
Gotcha. And do you do you foresee, or can you foresee how it might be used in other disciplines? I mean, I think the way you've described it seems very business, math, economics, startup, that sort of thing. But have you started sort of pushing the boundaries and what it might look like for other disciplines?
Very much so. I mean, we can tell any story, right? It's an interactive fiction
Hmm.
engine. And the whole idea of it actually was to move away from the mathy piece, because there's lots
Hmm.
of mathy simulations out there where it's like, what spending do you want to spend? We make it 4%, 4%, 5%, and then
Right.
Excel spreadsheet or system dynamic
Yeah.
model is chugging a number. That's not how the world works. What happens is if you increase R&D spend by 4%, the head of R&D is going to email you and say, why not 6%? The head of sales is going to email you and say, well, you fool, you're doing this. Like, that's the
Right.
interesting piece. So the whole idea is we
Yeah.
built like this fake inbox so we can play all kinds of games where you literally are getting
Mm.
messages from people. We also have all the stuff. If you want to run a full interactive fiction game, we want to teach the Odyssey by actually putting you on board as one of Odysseus' crew members, trying to desperately convince him to not listen to the sirens. Whatever you want to do, we can
Right.
build those
You
kind of
could do it.
settings. And the intent
Yeah.
is to build around that human interaction rather than just the math piece.
Right. That's very, very cool. So let's switch gears a little bit, because a few weeks ago, months ago now, you put out this, I guess, collection of data visualizations rendered by the DALL-E artificial intelligence tool. And so I'm not going to ask you to go into all the gory guts of how DALL-E works, but I guess I'm interested in why you decided to do that, how it worked from your perspective, just what seems to be kind of a more casual user, and were you surprised at the reaction that you got
Ye-
on Twitter?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of interesting things. I used Midjourney, which is
Yeah.
basically a different Dolly clone. They're all kind of the same. This one I got
Right.
access to more easily, so I used it. I think that the I study technology also, and there's always these sort of false starts and advancement in fields, right? People get really
Hmm.
excited, self-driving cars are going to be there, whatever the new
Right.
technology is, right? You know,
I'm still waiting for my
I'm
hoverboard, right?
a
From
hundred
Back
percent.
to the Future, right? Yeah.
But there are moments where things are accelerating and you really should be part of it, because what they're doing is not just the technology. There's no threshold we have to reach. It's fundamentally changing, I think, how we get to interact in an interesting way. And the
Hmm.
suite of sort of AI meets human technologies, right? So there's a whole bunch of things that generate. I have a colleague at Harvard who demonstrated a couple of fake Harvard cases that he had a different system generate, and they've read like Harvard cases. They were reasonably
Yeah. Yeah.
sensical. In the same way, I really enjoy art data visualization. I've got graphics, in my papers. I just am not that good at it, right? I've spent time over Stata, desperately trying to tune, something so I get the right. I've read all the books. I've got books on
Yeah.
fonts. I've read your stuff. Like I am,
Right.
I'm like, oh, this is so clever. I don't have the full chops to pull that off, right? But
Right. Right.
suddenly
Right.
here it's a different thing. It's a medium where I can write something and have it happen and tune it with words,
Yeah.
fundamentally expanding how something operates, right? We're using a human vocabulary to kind of generate things. And I think that, it was interesting that it took off. I think that there is this hunger for seeing different ways of visualizing and seeing the world, right? It's why, I I've got like you, I have a decent Twitter following, right? If you look at
Hmm.
every the tweets that are that go most viral are not the academic papers or anything else; those do fine. But it is anytime there's anything with a visualization, right? That is literally
Hmm.
what makes a Twitter tweet go is a visualization. The
Yeah.
more understandable the visualization is, the more likely to succeed. And it, of course, drives
Yeah.
me crazy that academics refuse, like myself, honestly, but we refuse to kind of put the good visualization there. We don't have the money, the time, the stuff to do that.
Yeah.
But now we're on the cusp of something new. So I think the idea of seeing something visual, and you could, in this set of styles that I was able to do 24 styles or whatever in the course of playing with it on and off over the course of a day, and
Yeah.
they represent something that's fundamentally different than what we've seen. They're
Right.
aping the style of Mondrian or whatever, but it's not.
Right.
There is something that a human wouldn't have necessarily come up with any of these, right?
Right. And you don't need to dive into Illustrator and do it pixel by pixel. Just let
It
it
takes
go.
seconds, right? Like I'm just
Yeah.
literally saying, bar chart, and then you play with a little to get the numbers working. And I'm not good at this. Like I'm a naive person writing this stuff down. Like there is a pseudocode language you can apply, but who cares? It
Right.
works, right? And
Yeah. Yeah.
I think there's something so exciting about that. And I think anybody who is interested in the visual space at all, in the policy space, in the data space, needs to spend an afternoon playing with these tools. I just can't emphasize enough that there is something really transformational there, and even if you bounce off of it, you won't regret it. I think.
Right. Yeah. So that leads to the other part that you already sort of alluded to, which is your Twitter feed. You spend a lot of time summarizing academic papers, which can't be easy, especially because you have to read some or most of them, which can't be easy. But um, I guess I'm curious about, as you mentioned, like your thought about the graphic space in academia, and is the reason why the graphs aren't better is because there's just not enough time, there's not enough skill, it's the editors, is it just the whole system?
So the short answer to all of your questions is yes. Obviously, like it's all obvious thing.
Right, right,
But
right.
there. Look, as academics, there is a disdain for public interaction that is not actually
Yeah.
wrong. Like there's a purity argument, and my
Yep.
mentor Ezra Zuckerman has talked extensively about this at MIT. There is a desire for purity in our field, right? There is something impure necessarily about talking to a general public that again, you could cross over that line. You could be one of the people who's it's okay to do it, right? But
Right,
but
right.
but there's no doubt that as a junior faculty member, you'll be warned away from doing that because it's a
Yeah, right,
distraction, right?
right.
And the same way, right? There's this theory I think about a lot, middle status conformity, which is that if you're competing with people, you're better off if you want to maintain middle status to look like everybody else.
Hmm.
Violating those norms is a way to get either elite or get punished, right? That's what elites
Right,
and punished. The elites will
right.
get away with it. They can violate a norm or not. So in the same way,
Yeah.
like, I want my paper accepted. So I am going to use default statagraph or R graphs to do this. And maybe if I'm really fancy,
Yeah.
I'll change the background color. But like showing I have any more time than that to do that, or that
Yeah.
is an indicator of a lack of seriousness or indication, right?
Mm.
So what ends up happening is the only really good graphics come out of some of the like science or a few other places seem to have graphic designers who help out with these things,
Yeah.
or graphical, abstract. But the result of something on Twitter, I'm sure you've seen the same thing, is that the graphs are, if you want to have something graphical that makes a huge difference, and the graphs that people tend to have that are most visible are scatter plots, and scatter plots
Hmm.
are in many ways the worst graphs to show because amateur critics attack them the most because they expect a scatter plot to show, they want to see R square. Like it lends itself to bad statistical analysis, right? Because a
Yeah.
scatter plot is
Yeah.
not the same thing as a controlled OLS,
Right.
right?
Right.
Regression
Regression.
analysis.
Right. Right.
So, so I think that there's some very simple ways to improve this, and there's some more complex ways, right? Simple ways, anything showing magnitudes, right? Any of the graphs that show confidence bands above and below zero for effects, with a table of effects. But I just would beg people to do this. This stuff matters. Like I now it's been really funny. I went to the big academic conference for the Academy of Management this year, and um, I've never been close to pseudo celebrity before, but people are like, oh, I read your Twitter feed. Like people clearly care about this. They send me articles
Yeah.
they'd like to see tweeted out. This little bit of extra work though they're not willing to do. So that's my feeling on the
Right.
graphic side. It's like it is way undercounted. The difference between a good one and a bad one. And when it gets noticed at a place like Twitter or somewhere else, people they get more citations, they get press
Right.
reach outs. It makes a difference.
Right. So there's definitely like a line of research there, right? Like just the way you said is like to actually quantify the impact of having better graphs. Of course, you have to sort of define that in some way. But if you were the editor of some journal, say Ethan's Journal of Management, what would your first step be to make the graphs in the articles in your journal better?
So I think it's that there's a lot of half-hearted pushes to do some of this, right? I think first of all, you need
Yeah.
one graph that communicates your your key point, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
like there, there was and I posted this before, but like, there's a few, heroic graphs that do that, right? There's a famous
Yeah.
study on on the price of wholesale fish. I don't know if you've
Mm-hmm.
seen this, the Curated Journal of Economics.
Yeah.
Again, I'll put the link so if people want to do this. But
Yeah.
it shows the fish prices before and after cell phones were implemented in India, and it's really about coordination and pricing. But the
Yeah.
chart is like up and down, and then suddenly the instant cell phones are there, the chart becomes completely flat. Right, all the
Oh,
fluctuations
nice.
disappear.
Yeah.
Instantly, get like, oh my god, I got this. Right, like there are
Yeah.
these kind of
Right.
graphs. Some of the graphs on income inequality, you've got them. So having something, spending the time to think what, you know, often involves taking something and turning into an order of magnitude that matters to people or an impact event, right?
Mm-hmm.
If I take, like, people are already using back of the envelope calculations, this would
Right.
cost $20 billion. This would save 2,000 lives. There needs to be a graph of that, the so what moment, as opposed to
Yeah.
just a graphical check on what you're doing, which is also important. But it's important to recognize that these are persuasive arguments. We're not wrong. We
Mm-hmm.
don't feel bad about persuading through our theory section. We don't feel bad about
Right.
persuading for evidence.
Right.
We should not feel bad about having a persuasive graph and arguing that it's a
Right.
persuasive graph.
Yeah. Yeah, it's always shocking to me when I argue to folks, make the title in your graph active and tell people what the argument is in the graph. They say, no, we can't do that because of this, that, and the other. And I'll say, okay, well, let's see what you've written in the text, and maybe we can find a middle ground between the descriptive title and the active title. And 99 times out of 100, what's in the paper, what's in the report is that active statement that's making an argument. And somehow there's still this break between the visual piece and
Uh,
the
People
text.
are scared of it in a way that
Yeah.
and it's a real problem, right? This should be the moment that you are able to kind of show why this matters and so what. And I think a lot of people know what that graph would be, and I think
Mm-hmm.
maybe having a special way of labeling it, right? Like this is my persuasive
Yeah.
conclusion, right?
Right. Right.
In some way or another, because they do that secretly through other graphs, right? You're only showing the ones that are really showing
Yeah.
what you want to show anyway,
Right. That's
right? Like
right.
it's not
Yeah.
like those are not selected out of a set of other
Right. That's
graphics.
right. There's all bias in there somewhere at some point. Yeah.
And then there's the self-sabotaging stuff. The people are like acronyms in your graph, like just
Oh,
the worst like, and this is MCBR6 if compared to MCB473/0.5. You're like, and then I end up,
I mean, come on. Yeah.
I mean, so there just is this, and I think people get caught up a lot on visual niceness, which is, I think, important. But I think you would do just a lot with like, what are the
Mm-hmm.
two things that matter? What are the dependent? What's the
Right.
dependent variable? What's the variable that matters? And you're allowed to be straightforward about this. Show me your 95% confidence interval. Like, do that. All of that's great, but like, show me something that is interesting or
Yeah.
shows change.
Yeah. So let's bring these two pieces together. So when you think about the Wharton Interactive and the simulator and the games, do you see, or maybe you're doing it now, but do you at least see sort of training for future academics to help them think more? I don't even want to say more visually, because it's not just the visual piece; it's how people write as well, right? But do you help them think about those sorts of pieces in their research?
I mean, I think that the idea is thinking about how you apply stuff and what lessons people are really trying to learn outside of a purely academic framework, what we call closing the theory practice gap, right? Like we
Hmm.
do it in our classrooms, but we're often afraid to do it to the outside world. So part of what we
Yes.
do is
Yeah.
help people tell stories, literal stories, right? So we'll meet with an academic. It turns out that when they're telling us something really important about the world, but they're kind of afraid to close that gap. But if you put it into a story
Mhm.
format or something like a graphical format, suddenly this stuff becomes apparent, right? Like put
Yeah.
people in the grounds of trying to, and the great thing about games, just like graphics, is you can constrain the ground raw. Like I could set up a situation where your research matters and make it clear these are boundary conditions where it matters. But now I'm in a world where I wish I knew that paper, right? I could put you in that
Right.
world, right? Where it
Right.
matters that you know that result or that answer. Where you
Yeah.
can play with alternative outcomes, right? Another thing that we do that actually we've done graphically in the game is like actually letting people modify projections, and you can see the effect on a
Mhm.
long-term graph.
Right.
There's just the world is advancing very quickly, like on that world of
Mhm.
interactivity and graphics, and we have so many other problems with how academic papers are formatted and published and paywalls and
Right.
everything else. And just to refuse to take the advance that what's happening here of storytelling and like
Yeah.
it's a problem, and it's a growing one.
So do you think you mentioned earlier the danger of junior faculty being that different person doing the better graphs, but do you think that that junior faculty or people who are coming into the academic field in the next few years, that they will ultimately be behind if they're not thinking in the ways that you're arguing, more visually, better writing, thinking about broader
I
audiences?
mean, I think they already are, right? Like, I think the issue is it's already a two-sided game, right? People may
Hmm.
frown on Twitter engagement or something else, right? And I dread how do you have the time? It's because I'm an academic who just gets easily bored during things and then reads a bunch of stuff. It's like, this is it. I actually find everything we do interesting. Like, there's so much good work out there. Like, that's the thing I'm
Yeah.
learning. So much good work, right? I mean, I can show you all the stats and how we're drowning in science, but like, I'm amazed, and that's not even counting working. But like, there's so much good and important work out there that nobody will ever read or care about. Right.
Right.
And so it already is that, look, if you can get, we may not like it, we may not agree with, but like, we may not tell people it's true, but if you get a New York Times piece covering your research, it's going to get cited more. People are going to pay
Yeah.
attention. You might have to deal with some jealousy, but like it matters, right? But we're telling
Right.
people it doesn't matter, but it obviously matters. So now people
Right.
have to play a two-sided game where on one
Yeah.
hand, they have to say, I don't really care about what people think of this. I am purely interested in the life of the mind. And then on the other
Right.
hand, they're trying to, you're trying to, so putting this together in an honest way would make sense, right? I
Hmm.
was just, reading about the late 15th century scholarship, and there were all these
Hmm.
traveling scholars who would you'd try and get hired by patrons, right, in Europe to
Hmm.
teach their children. That's how you'd make all the money. So you had to become
Yeah.
prominent to do that. And the only way to be prominent was to pick very public fights with other scholars, so that and that
Okay.
way you'd be noticed, or be like, oh,
Right. Notice it.
he's controversial. Then they'd hire you. And
Right.
I feel the same sort of stuff happens. Like there is advantage of being picked and being prominent and being noticed. And I think
Right.
acknowledging that, and it starts with graphics, right? It honestly does. Like the graphs
Yeah.
are the persuasive connection between the general public and academic work.
Yeah. Love it. Love it. I'm with you. We're fighting the same battles. I love it. Ethan, thanks so much for coming on the show. I feel like we covered a ton today. I really
This was
appreciate it.
fun. I
And
can't wait to keep reading your stuff, which I always think is awesome.
thanks.
And also, by the way, some of your exercises on on teaching this stuff is great, and everyone should check you out if they haven't already. It's really no, it's
Thanks.
terrific.
Yeah.
I've thought about it a lot, especially introducing these concepts. It's wonderful.
These
Yeah.
games. Yeah. Yeah. That's great. All right. Well, thanks again. I really appreciate you coming on the show.
All right. Thank you. Bye bye.
And thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of the show. I hope you'll check out Ethan's website. Check out the simulation tool that he has, Wharton Interactive. Really interesting work there. Check out his Twitter feed, especially if you're interested in academic research. And maybe there's some ways that you can help folks improve how they communicate their data visually. So until next time, this has been the PolicyViz podcast. Thanks so much for listening.